Good evening, and welcome to the Perspecticast, a podcast companion to the Panda Perspectives Substack. I am always keen to record an explanatory pod going into maybe the finer details or things that didn't quite make it into a particular piece of research. And I feel like with the three articles that are currently out on the semiconductors, there are a couple of things that maybe I take for granted, but they're kind of worth repeating and maybe worth noting. Wanted to jump straight in and go in with, I make these comparisons between East and West, and East is this and West is that, but what are East and West? I think it's, again, much like so many other things we seem to arrive at, it's not a clear dividing line, and it's much more of a continuum, unfortunately, because it would have been so much easier, had it been a clear dividing line. But are Japanese companies, for example, East or West? Well, I mean, geographically, obviously East, ideologically, obviously West. Let's move on. Except the trade between Japan and China in especially devices, but anything to do with semiconductors is growing. And for a lot of Japanese companies, Chinese customers are between quarter and a half of total orders. So can we really say that Japan isn't part of the Eastern chain? It's difficult, right? And it's much more nuanced than, red or blue, or I suppose whatever color you want to attach to either side. And so I think this is an important note to make, that instead of bifurcation, we're actually seeing a lot more integration between the sort of various members of the supply chain all the way through. And on the extreme ends, sure, you see NVIDIA and AMD being told not to export their sorts of higher end chips, sure, and very clearly see, well, that's the line, right? But everything but that, effectively, the line is really quite blurry. And sort of following on that, right? Well, what does it do, this blurry line? So let's consider ASML. Obviously, in article number 3, we're talking about equipment makers, and obviously, very broadly speaking, right? Again, something we maybe don't go into the detail of in the pieces themselves, but sort of very simplistically speaking, right? You gotta have, a wafer is this big shiny thing upon which everything is cut out of and projected onto and edited onto, and lithography machines actually project light onto that wafer to give it, those semiconductor looking things. And then obviously we have etchings and depositions, or to really sort of identify various parts of the wafer and put on extra material on it, depending on what's necessary, right? So these are effectively separate workflows, but obviously the most important part of it is the lithography, is the machine that shines light on the wafer. If we look at the way that NVIDIA is beating out Chinese competition today, notwithstanding, where we obviously have seen a sort of spectacular moves in some of these Chinese producers, why is NVIDIA outperforming everybody else so much stronger when ASML, that has a seemingly similar dominance of their niche, is not, right? 52-week lows recently, and it doesn't look like it's turning around anytime soon. Well, it's because on the NVIDIA side, the demand is incredibly strong, and what we keep talking about is how Chinese companies find ways of either importing through third countries or going to third countries and using NVIDIA installations in those third countries to train their AI models and things like that. Whereas with equipment, we're just dealing with a market where competition is being brought up very quickly, right? And there's already a ban on importing any of SML's equipment into China, especially the most modern ones. And it's a binary thing. It's a yes or a no. And the answer is currently no. Similarly, after sales services, which is a meaningful portion of ASML's revenue, again, not a lot they can do in terms of servicing previously sold machines into China. So with all of that, the revenue potential has already been cut off. And in turn, it turns out that China is actually progressing rather nicely through their own technology stack, right? And figuring out ways of manufacturing both chips and machines that make chips, from lithography to etching to deposition, all these things, right? Obviously, we'll go into some detail on that in the report, so do please check it out. But the one thing I want to kind of maybe verbalize is the fact that it's not a race to catch up with ASML, right? That's not a formulation of the job, the way that the Chinese equipment makers see it. I mean, it may be part of it for sure, catch up and overtake ASML, but there is a differentiated approach, both in terms of pushing different kinds of technology forward to see if maybe ASML is not, in fact, the best possible way of developing chips. For example, with SME, the currently private but soon to be public closest competitor to ASML, obviously their focus is on DUV machines rather than EUV lithography machines, right? So the plan there is to see if they can maybe push DUV technology further and see if maybe that there is a way. Now, the assumption is right now that it's not possible. It was always going to be inferior to EUV, and it will not be uh, like, you basically try and figure out ways of using various trickery called patterning that they can really make those chips small enough, right? That's the idea. Something that comes fairly naturally to the EV process, but of course, uh, the question is, can they do it, right? They were able to do it on the 5 and the 7 nanometer processes so far. Is this the limit? Some people say yes, some people say, well, maybe there are more adjustments they can make and they can maybe move it further still. We don't really know. What we know is they're trying. And then the question is, even if they don't quite get it to the size of nodes that we can generate, maybe there is a chance that through throughput, and they'll make good enough chips that are capable of delivering up-to-date performance that will suit the needs of Chinese companies. Maybe. But then, of course, at the same time, they're also pushing in other directions. They are looking at nano imprints, for example, and electron beam lithography. So like new ways of doing it that completely bypasses EUV, right? So that will be very interesting to see if Chinese companies can leapfrog effectively present-day technology and into the future. Now, again, unlikely, but not impossible. And also, what's helping them along the way is that as they improve all the other machines in the cycle, so like etching and deposition, right? So imperfections in one part of the process are not really made up for by catching up on the others, but it certainly means that there is less of a drag as you move forward, and that's the only bit that you need to figure out. So I think this is the interesting bit, and as such, there are so many ways in which ASML can not do that well in the 2030s, right? So they ranging from strong Chinese competition to being behind on the technological trend, all these things that are potentially also a problem for literally any other part of the value chain, but ASML is the one where it's quite obvious. So again, do please check out the full report where I go into the details on all of this, but I think conceptually this for me has been the most interesting takeaway. On other fronts, I think what I would like to note is that the second article, the one about the Chinese industrial policy in the field, I think the most interesting aspect of it is how big a number we're talking about here, because sure, we're throwing around like large numbers from Japan to Korea's to Chinese spending all up to almost $1 trillion all in, but TSMC alone spends nearly 70 billion on R&D capex every year. And you look at Nvidia and you look at all the hyperscalers in the US spending money, all these numbers, I mean, they would have seemed absurdly high, 5, 6 years ago, but now it's unfortunately par for the course. And I would say there is an argument out there to say that China isn't spending enough. Now, this is not an argument that I would like to focus on particularly because it's quite frankly speculative, because it's hard to come to a purchasing power parity number, right? Like how much does, this sort of budget buy you in terms of engineering time, in terms of talent and things like that, right? So it's very hard. It's dollars spent in China are not the same value as dollars spent in America on account of higher salaries and just higher cost of things, right? Nevertheless, I am understanding of that argument just given the sort of the just sheer amounts that are being committed to AI-related capex all over the world, and in the US and Taiwan in particular. So, having established all of that, I think I wouldn't be surprised to see if we're going to see Big Fund 4 and Big Fund 5 that might be hundreds of billions of dollars, or like trillions of RMB, because this is the world we live in now, right? And this is the sort of scope and scale of things that one can expect in this day and age. And so I guess my feedback would be to not be alarmed, right? I mean, this is not money being wasted, although we don't know which parts of that are being wasted, but they're pulling on all sorts of strings. And this applies to the entire sector, by the way. This applies to American companies, Taiwanese companies, East and West, as it were. Only at the very end of the race will we actually find out which will not worth pursuing. But by that time, we would have already spent the money on them, so it's what it is. Maybe as a sort of as a final point to come back to the question about East and West, I have maybe a theoretical thing that I've been sort of playing around. What is the impact of a massive Chinese boom in capex, in expenditure, and in this technological push, right? To what degree are China's neighbors going to be key suppliers to them, or competitors, or collaborator? This is, I don't think we know for sure just yet, right? I'm also not sure that it's, looking at the map and saying, look, this is Taiwan, this is China. Obviously, the relationships aren't great at the moment. They're going to be on the opposite sides. If you look at manufacturing history and the history of development of manufacturing in China, you'll see Taiwanese companies have historically been very involved in all of this, right? And to say that this was then, this is now, it kind of misses the point, because it was always done on a sort of a person-to-person level and company-to-company level, as opposed to government sanctioned or anything like that. So it's not entirely out of the question that Taiwanese and Japanese and Korean suppliers will be the beneficiaries of this Chinese push as well as victims. So, of course, some will lose market share, some will lose a lot of market share to Chinese products, some will be suppliers and participants in the new value chains. So, this is maybe the most relevant part for the geopolitically minded amongst you to see which way the wind is going to be blowing here. I do not accept the premise that it will all be just China or China all the way, and because there's just too much stuff that they need to figure out, and it was much easier and much more achievable to outsource a bunch of stuff to Korea and Japan and Taiwan, especially on a fairly near-term basis, 5 to 10 years sort of thing. We will obviously get into the details of each and individual portion of the value chain in the future, where we will address this point in a bit more detail, but I thought this is an important theoretical framework that I would like to encourage you to start thinking and along and use. And as such, sort of, maybe go back and reread the reports, or maybe revisit some of the conclusions from there, to see if maybe with this sort of lens, your take would be somewhat different. As ever, I'm always happy to hear feedback, so let me know what you think. Do please subscribe and read the reports. I am putting an awful lot of effort into them. I think the article number 3 was particularly good, so do please check it out if you haven't already. Again, my goal is to make sure that by the end of this 6-week period, we will come out as experts in the Asian semiconductor landscape, and I think we've made good progress along the way so far. Do please check out the Substack, subscribe, upgrade to full membership if you haven't. I always appreciate it. With that, I wish you a very good day, and I will speak to you next week.